Now you're very welcome along to the Huddle Breakdown. Enda here with you, and we're going to be looking back on Celtic's 2-0 win over Dundee United at the weekend, as well as looking at Celtic's transfer window as the window shuts tightly closed at the end of this evening, and we're going to be giving it a sort of a rating based on the ins and outs of the January transfer window. Players coming into the club, players leaving the club. Ange Postecoglou basically confirmed earlier today, that there will be no more incomings into the club, but outgoings. There are still things happening in the background. So expect a couple of players to leave Celtic before that midnight window shuts. I'm doing that, of course, in the company of my usual compatriots, and that is Alan Morrison, Celtic by Numbers, and Jaco James. Guys, how are you getting on?
Okay.
I'm doing well, thanks.
So it was another win for Celtic at the weekend. I have to admit, at the start of this podcast, I didn't actually get to catch the game live. I was busy at the weekend, but I did watch the replays and the various different angles that Celtic put up on their YouTube channel. So I'm going to be leaning heavily on you for your analysis of this game. So I'll throw it to you first, Alan. I mean, another penalty potentially not given to Kyogo for that sort of, I don't know what you wanted to call melee from the goalkeeper coming out to try punch, and I don't know how you would even begin to describe what that was, and then another sort of a header at the back post from Jota from a looping ball, probably a lucky ball that managed to stay in play from Mooy. So, what are your overall thoughts on this win?
Yeah, very similar to many games, which probably isn't terribly enthralling analysis, but in the sense that, obviously Dundee United set up with a back five, which we're starting to see more and more now, the 5 defenders strung across the box with a fairly tight midfield 3 and then 2 forwards. So, it's not a bad strategy, because if you're keeping 2 up, you've got the chance to break. And actually, in that first half, Dundee United had a couple of promising moments where, mainly because of wind-assisted confusion, it looked like they were like 2-on-2 or even 1-on-1 at one instance. Middleton got a run at Carter Vickers, but he was never going to get past him. So that kind of worked out okay. Having said all that, the most pleasing aspect for me, again, is really the relative lack of threat from the opposition, really sort of limiting them to 4 attempts at goal. 2 were on target, but they were kind of, one was a shot from outside the box, a sort of half volley, and one was a sort of back post header. So neither of them were particularly dangerous. I had the XG at just under 0.4. I think other sites had it even lower than that as far as Dundee United are concerned. So I think that's starting to become, quite a consistent, well, it has been for some time, to be fair, a consistent feature that Celtic are limiting the opposition. And I don't think they can squeeze the chances that other teams create down any lower, frankly. I just don't think it's possible. So that's all good. I think Celtic will be satisfied, because here was a very, very windy day on a bumpy pitch against a team battling relegation. So really looking to limit Celtic any way they could. Even when they were 2-0 down, they really weren't forcing the game. So I think Celtic will be given the sort of external factors and the physical factors around, what the weather was like and the pitch was like. I think it's a satisfactorily comfortable victory. I mean, I said at half time, again, just be patient. I wasn't worried. We've got 5 subs to come on. The bench was incredibly strong. But actually, as it turned out, we didn't really need the bench at all. And actually, once the 2 goals were scored, Celtic pretty much just managed the game out. Very little happened in the last 30 minutes of the match at all. But we'll come to Oh's little cameo later. That was probably the only moment of sort of genuine interest in that. So yeah, I would say satisfactory, really, given the conditions. Very solid, relatively solid at the back, and did enough. And I think, as I said, I'm not sure I can say anything more riveting than that. So I'll let James have a go.
Yeah, we might come back to the way that Dundee United set up just in a little while. But James, what are your initial thoughts on this one?
Yeah, kind of a run-of-the-mill, which is acceptable. Again, we can't be lights out every game. So, to Alan's point, and I'd WhatsApped this to you guys beforehand, is if there's one emerging trend, it is potentially, again, when only takes 2 points to make a line, right? Remember from math class? Even I remember that, and even though it's many, many years ago. And so a trend is emerging potentially of clubs, kind of following that St. Mirren roadmap of the 5-3-2 or some iteration of 5 at the back, a relatively narrow midfield. There's been some tweaking on that. Some are a little bit more aggressive in coming out and shuffling those midfielders, I would argue, to our benefit. But so yeah, it within that context and the elements, as Alan said, I thought it was kind of a solid run-of-the-mill winter game performance, comfortable 2-0.
Mm-hmm. I have to remind myself at times, and again, it's probably worth remembering as supporters, that we're currently at the 31st of January, but in reality, we're more in the 2nd of January when it comes to where we're at in the current season, because of the World Cup being delaying the action for so long. So we're actually currently coming out of our Christmas break in reality. So we're still in that grind of, wet pitches, windy days, bumpy surfaces, mucky stadiums, that's where we're at. So I think getting away from Dundee United with a 2-0 win is pretty solid at this stage of the season, and hopefully it'll continue on. And in terms of the way that Dundee United set up and what James is saying here, Alan, I mentioned this when Jim Goodwin actually admitted that his Aberdeen side set up like St. Mirren did when they beat Celtic earlier in the season. Is there a danger that clubs are being almost are oversimplifying the idea and way that you go about beating the Celtic side because St. Mirren beat them once in a season? I mean, that is the literal outlier in Celtic season so far. If I'm a football manager, that's not what I'm basing my approach to a game against Celtic is. So I just find it surprising that is the one that people are choosing to go for. I know it's natural that that's the one that was successful, but it was one in how many games that Celtic have played this season in the league. It's surely not what you should be basing it off.
Yeah, it's a tricky one because, as I say, as we've said many times, it's clearly such a resource gulf between Celtic and virtually all the other teams that, you are limited a little bit in terms of how do you approach these games, because, going toe-to-toe, it would be incredibly brave. Although we have seen teams do that a little bit in the past, it generally results in Celtic scoring quite a lot of goals, even if the opposition get a bit of joy. So, there being various flavours of defensive alignment and depth are the way to go. I mean, there are things you can do. You don't have to play so deep. You could push up and try and squeeze the game. That's something that maybe Livingston might do a little bit. You can press more aggressively and try and put Celtic, especially centre backs, and especially Starfelt, under more pressure. So there are always tweaks and decisions that you have to make, and that obviously depends on your personnel. But I think you're right that we're almost starting to see an orthodoxy about how the opposition is setting up against Celtic with that 5 at the back and then a narrow 3, try and forcing them wide. And is it, there's no evidence that it's being any more effective now. Is it not being effective because it's predictable to Celtic, or is it just actually this sheer chasm in quality of the players means that it almost doesn't matter what you do, what kind of Celtic will get you in the end? And I think for me there's a bit of that in that just the sheer depth now of the squad quality means that if you can at least be putting the other opposition under pressure, if you can maintain control, possession, and play quickly to force them to cover quickly, to force them to be without the ball for long periods, you're just simply going to tire the team out, whether they're playing a 4-4-2, a 5-3-2, or whatever it is. And then if you've got almost equal qualities come off the bench, then you're going to exploit tiredness in both minds and bodies. So I think it's probably more interesting to see if, like a Hearts, for example, what approach they might take. If they took the same approach with better players, they could probably get a better outcome. And obviously, against the Rangers, it's going to be a very different approach because, again, obviously they have got better players. So that's of more interest. But I think the sort of bottom 6 or bottom 8, if you want to say, teams who quite obviously have no pretension really to come and try and outplay Celtic. I think there is an orthodoxy, but does it matter? I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I think I certainly don't envy being a manager in Scotland, because you have two things you have to keep in mind. One is playing against Celtic and Rangers. The other is playing against everybody else in the league. So you're going to set up differently against Rangers and Celtic to what you set up against the teams that you're actually competing with in reality for positions in the table. And I think personally, the only thing that I can think of that is going to give you an advantage against Celtic and Rangers, especially Celtic and this Ange Postecoglou team, is getting your team as fit as humanly possible for them and going toe-to-toe with them in fitness and trying to win the battle of attrition in the most old school of ways. I don't think sitting back is going to do it, because Celtic will get you. I don't think pushing forward and having a high line is going to get it. I think it has to be something in between, and just being able to keep up with them in fitness levels is the only thing that I can think of that would be, it would narrow the gap between the quality of the sides. But that's another day's discussion. James, hyperbole is certainly something that we get quite a bit in Scottish football, and we are being served up a huge pot of hyperbole from Charlie Nicholas today. He has reeled back and apologised to Aaron Mooy for writing him off when he signed for Celtic for the first couple of weeks, and he said that Aaron Mooy is now the best player in the country since the World Cup. I will add, since the World Cup. I don't know if it means that he's genuinely the best player overall, or if he's just the best player in form, but he said he's the best player in Scotland. I mean, he's not wrong if he's talking about just form. Aaron Mooy is in absolutely flying form in that new number 8 role that he's been playing in. But, I mean, it's a bit of a stretch.
Yeah. Some of the punditry is, fun, shall we say. But I mean, he's been, we talked about this last week. I mean, he's been playing well against not great competition and in games where we're dominating, and he's not getting heavily pressured when he's on the ball. He's kind of got a lot of space and time to operate for the most part. And you give a guy with that kind of skill level that kind of time and space, and he's going to hurt you. So, what's the objective framework for measuring or assigning who's the quote unquote best player? I mean, there's all kinds of fun ways to go about doing that and talking about it. I don't think he's in the top 3 or 4 best players on Celtic, let alone in the league personally. But he's as we talked about, he's valuable. I mean, he's doing a very good job, and I think that the real acid test is going to be as we, have what looks like might be 4 games left against Rangers potentially, and that's going to be, I think, and maybe Hearts a little bit. To Alan's point, I'm less enthralled with Hearts. I think their defensive setup leaves a lot to be desired. So I don't think they really present all that much threat to us overall. Maybe on a one-off, they could give us some problems if they score some worldies and get some mystical referee help, that kind of thing. But he's going to continue. Mooy's going to continue to absolutely dominate against these level of opponents, playing in an Ange Postecoglou side.
I don't think we need a formula. It's Callum McGregor. He is the best player in Scotland. It's
Kyogo, Jota, CCV. I mean, real quick, I think it's hard to displace any of those. But
it would take a strong man to get me off this hill that Callum McGregor is just miles and miles the best player in Scotland. By a country mile, he's the best player.
And the way he's being utilized,
in my opinion. Yeah.
He's got a smart manager who's put him in a place in a role that's accentuating his strengths, and not asking him to do a lot of things that maybe aren't his best areas. So that's what a good manager does.
Yeah. Alan, a word on Mooy and then a word on Johnston, because I know you're getting very intrigued by our new right back.
Yeah, no, I'm probably a little bit more enamoured by Mooy than James is. Because I just think he's just such an intelligent player, and I think it's rare. I think going back to don't unpick the previous conversation, but this quite an interesting exchange on Twitter about why is it in Scottish football that so many teams are long ball, and it's pretty depressing actually. It seems to be the orthodoxy. And when you talk to their Enda about how do teams adapt when they're playing Celtic, then they're playing Motherwell the next week, what have you, well, they still play long ball by and large. So there's not a lot of variety in Scottish football in tactically in that sense. And it's also a bit of a mystery as to why Scotland has ended up here, given that Scotland was traditionally the home of passing or push and run, as it used to be called back in the sort of 1920s, but generally, passing skillful football. And obviously Lisbon Lions, we don't need to overstretch that point. So coming back to Aaron Mooy then, I think it is for me gratifying to see somebody who is very different to the type of footballer we get in Scotland, in that he seems to be able to slow the game down to his pace, which might seem counterintuitively, might seem a problem. You might think I'm being kind of counterintuitive there, but I just think he has such a good picture in his head, and he knows what he's going to do. It's more that sort of calmness, that experience that he brings to the team in a way which, with a lot of young midfielders around him, whether it's Hatate, O'Reilly, even Turnbull, and young wingers ahead of him, he just calms everything down for everybody, and you can therefore maintain that control whilst also having that threat. Now, is he absolutely the best fit for a sort of Ange ball, where it is a lot of running, it is a lot of counter pressing, etc. Well, probably not. And I think, James's big buddy over at the Cynic, Stephen, actually wrote a really interesting piece about how actually Moy's a problem for Celtic because he hasn't got the pace or athleticism to dominate the central areas, and so he's actually drifting wide. Whereas, the way that O'Reilly, for example, is being used this season is to push him up and try and get him beyond the strikers. So that was an interesting point, and I think we'd all have doubts as to how Aaron Mooy would do in the Champions League. But again, look how he played in the World Cup. Now, Australia in the World Cup is probably not that far off Celtic in Champions League in terms of the relative strength of the opposition, and he did a great job of trying to get the game played on Australia's level, on Australia's pace, versus the other team dominating. So I think there's a lot more there, and I've been utterly, almost blown away really by how effective he is, how intelligent he is, and I'm not being influenced by the sort of Shankland Tavernier high penalty count. He's getting into great positions as well. I know it was only Morton, but he had 15 touches in the box against Morton.
Yeah.
I mean, it was an absolutely admirable bit of stat padding against Morton that he undertook in terms of the number of shots, his XG, and touches in the box. And of course, you wouldn't replicate that consistently against better teams. But yeah, sorry.
Before you move on to Johnson, because I know he asked you about him, but can I come across on the drifting into wide spaces sort of debate? I think that's entirely on purpose. I think that's not a can't control the midfield situation. That is they're playing loads of people back. I'm going to make this run to stretch their defense and allow another person to make a run elsewhere after the players follow me. I mean, it's a positive thing that he's drifting into these wide positions because he's creating loads of space for people, and you see it time and time again. Once he makes that run, I think that's a trigger for our strikers to make another run. I don't think that's a negative aspect of this game at all.
Yeah, sorry, go on, James.
I was just going to say the other element to all of this is there's the inevitable delicate balance between imposing one's will and how that intersects with what the opposition is doing, right? So so we're talking about this move towards the St. Mirren quote unquote framework of this 5-3-2 in a relatively, let's say, narrow midfield. Well, there are different ways to deploy that, and we've seen that in more pure man-to-man marking, where they're chasing guys around, more zonal hybrids of man marking, as I call it. Going back to my 1980s John Chaney Temple University college basketball days of amoeba defense, where you get kind of this hybrid between man and zonal, which I think is actually the worst thing that we want to see. I think that would give us the most problem. So when you're getting guys getting man marked, pulling guys wide, and this interchanging, it's, I think, pretty clearly orchestrated by how Ange wants people moving. And again, this is not happening in isolation. That's kind of how the Manchester City franchise plays more so now. And they happen to have a geospatial expert heading up their analytics department that deals with spacing. So, so yeah, I think it's very complicated. And I think there's an argument to be made that kind of more advanced role for O'Reilly hasn't suited him all that well either. That's another discussion to be had. I mean, in that I think a lot of his strengths have been from playing a little deeper. And again, if I'm an opponent, I want to be crowding that kind of half space, compressing the space between the lines centrally, and not allowing guys like Mooy and O'Reilly to have the ball in those zones. Even HUDDLE, as we saw again, he can, that's a whole other debate as we've had continually, but, he's capable in those areas of real damage. And you saw that again against United. I mean, with these trying to man mark HUDDLE, if you're, the Dundee United midfield, not going to work real well. So, with the interchanging that's going on in the runs and the passing, I mean, with guys fatiguing, again, it's this recipe, it might take a little while, as Alan says, but with patience, it's just a matter of when, not if.
Yeah, and on final point on the runs that he makes out towards the wing, I don't think that's necessarily part of the choreographed plays that Celtic have necessarily. I think that's just a clever player making clever runs and understanding where the space is and understanding how that affects everyone else amongst them. I think it's just him taking his own initiative. And we do see that with the best of teams. It's, you have this structure in play, you play to a general structure, and then you have really clever players who interact within that structure that causes absolute chaos. Because if you just have a structure and you stick to it and this is all you do, then it becomes really predictable. So Aaron Mooy brings a little bit of unpredictability into the play.
Yeah, it's not a matter of orchestration. That's why, again, going back to the basketball analogy is a good one, because particularly in the evolution of the game of basketball since the 1950s, there's been a lot of these spatial concepts that have broken out and changes in rules, meaning that I think it was George Mikan was the first big man that would camp out in the lane in basketball and pro basketball, and basically just shut down opposition attacks. And then they changed the rules. They said you can't be in the lane for more than 3 seconds because this guy is ruining the game. All right. And then they put the 3-point line in to, again, create space and zone thing, pull out the defense. So, these concepts of space and how do you use them and movement, a lot of times they're not orchestrated. They're principled. And when guys move into space, that creates other pockets of space, and it's a dynamic, and this is where that spatial intelligence of players, where they understand what the plan is, not that it's a set play. It's okay. This is it's more like jazz than sheet music. And that's, I think that's how we're playing. I don't think it's like scripted plays.
Yeah, it's like you have the theory in place, and then you interact within the theory of how you want to do it practically yourself. If anybody wants a much more sort of refined explanation of what we're talking about here, there's a 35-second clip of Johan Cruyff explaining space and how to understand it on a football pitch on YouTube. Just go and watch that, and it's like 35 seconds, you understand what his philosophy of football is and what most modern football clubs play to in terms of their philosophy. But we'll delve into that a little bit later on, maybe in the year when there's less action actually going on the pitch. Alan, I cut across you there before you got to talk about your new favourite Celtic player, Alistair Johnson.
That's fine. No, yeah, listen, early days, right? And obviously 900 minutes and all that good stuff, right? But yeah, just some early thoughts, really. what a fascinating player. And I know that obviously, well, I say he hasn't been tested. I mean, he played at Ibrox. He got involved in some meaty challenges. He was giving out the verbals, and he had a pretty solid game of football as well. So, you know, the guy's got kind of character about him. It's just if you look at his kind of stats from the last couple of games, he profiles defensively, he profiles like a centre-back in terms of the volume and success of his challenging and winning the ball back, and also his ability to force turnovers. And he also has, in both of the last two games, had the highest overall packing score, and that's a mixture of passing and receiving the ball. And he does all of those things without ever looking like he's taking any risks at all. And I just find that really fascinating. And, you know, we saw him against Dundee United have a shot from the edge of the box from a central position. We saw him attempt a couple of through balls. One to Hyeon-Gyu actually created the best chance of the first half. So he's just a really fascinating mix of extreme defensive solidity with consistent but unshowy ball progression, with the odd tiny little sliver of magic thrown in as well, but we don't see it that often. He's normally pretty just kind of solid and safe in everything that he does. So I just think he's a fascinating player, but I can't remember having a fullback that posts such incredible defensive numbers. And I know it's early days, and I know like usual caveats and what have you, but it's one to keep an eye on for sure.
Do you think he might suffer from the perception that he's a safe player?
No, because as I say, the packing stats tend to reward you for aggressive forward passing. Whether it's
but in terms
moving,
of in terms of the eye test more than the underlying metrics.
When I've watched both games, I've thought, oh, he's being a bit safe, he's being a bit conservative, and then you see the data kind of rack up over 90 minutes. You think, hang on, there's actually a lot more going on here. You know, he's just not showy. I mean, in terms of the eye test, he's not flamboyant. He's not. You know, Juranovic was very eye-catching in the way he would kind of buccaneer forward in quite a sort of eye-catching style. You know, Ralston's got his sort of, you know, his bandy legs and his, you know, once he gets going type of thing. Even Greg Taylor's got a little bit of a sort of swagger about him when he sprints forward. But Johnston's just kind of, he glides. He looks a little bit stiff almost, because, you know, almost a little bit robotic sometimes. And
looks like a hockey player.
Well, yeah, but actually, again, if you rack up all his stats, and you know, again, I look at 90-minute performances, not 30-second highlight reels. Okay, so that's my all of this is about 90-minute performances. It's just deeply impressive numbers that belie a little bit how he looks when you see him on the ball.
Mm-hmm. I always think that Greg Taylor looks like he's just got the worst news possible on the football pitch. Like, he always seems to just have this sort of like absolutely like he killed his puppy sort of look on his face every time the camera goes tight on him on the football pitch. But one final thought on the Dundee United game then, James. It was a debut for Hyeon-Gyu Oh up front for Celtic, came off the bench. And the one thing I took from this, and this is entirely just looking at him, he doesn't look like what he was described as, this big, strong, burly striker who's going to cause chaos in the box. He looks a little bit more refined than that.
Yeah, I think, you know, again, that this is the old recency bias because of who he's replacing, and you know, the fact that was such a pronounced part of Giakoumakis's play. I think he's far more well-rounded. When I did kind of my data profiling thing that I do typically with new signings, he was pretty clearly a more robust player than Giakoumakis. I mean, on the ball in particular, and I think you saw that. I think what'll be interesting is obviously he's just in the door. He probably, I mean, just practically speaking, you know, the patterns of play that we just got done talking about, that orchestrating the jazz musician aspect of this, he's just not going to have that intuitively ingrained. So even Kyogo, for example, he made some movements out wide that, again, I wrote a column on this recently at the Celtic Way about the way that we've been using our strikers and the limited, and Alan and I have talked about this a lot on here, but the scope of it's pretty extreme. And some of his movements were analogous to kind of standard striker play. Whereas even with Kyogo, who's, again, been in the system for well over a year now, doesn't make a whole lot of those movements. So I think it'll be interesting as he ramps up his involvement and kind of synthesizes what his role is and expectation is in the side. It'll be interesting to see whether or not he gets more freedom or whether he's going to be asked to kind of play that more central defined role as the 9 in the system. If I can go back to Alistair Johnston real quick. Yeah. I also find him fascinating because, I think I mentioned this when we signed him, is to me almost profiles as a right center back and a back 3. And to Alan, what Alan's talking about from his data profile so far, I think that, you look at his strengths, that seems to fit with that, even in the small sample. And I think what'll be interesting is because he doesn't seem to have that kind of quick lateral movement and the darting runs. Like, that doesn't seem to be likely to be his strength. So it'll be interesting, again, this idea of space and this interchange, how much does he get forward and get involved in that, where Ralston and, to a lesser degree, Juranovic would. Ralston has really been prominent with that when he plays. And his delivery, Ralston has had that ability to really get involved in attack and get good service into the box and good cutback crosses, that kind of thing. I just doesn't look like that's going to be Johnston's strength. So it'll be interesting to see how he fits in this kind of inverted fullback role if we persist with that kind of same style of play and setup. It seems like it'll play up a lot better in Europe. I mean, it's almost like he would suit better against a team where we're not going to dominate the ball as much, because of that defensive solidity might help. Whereas maybe so I'm not being negative on it. Actually, I think if you look at the balance of our attack and our system, that might not be such a bad thing as we think about, playing against better sides.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense, because you play inverted fullbacks for 2 reasons. One is comfortability on the ball and being able to, be part of the build-up play. But the second part of that is the defensive aspect of things, where you are trying to cut out the transition as much as possible. I know there was a video of Sean Dyche going around explaining the 4-4-2 that he played at Burnley, because obviously he's taken the Everton job now. And he spoke about the transition, saying that it is the single most important aspect of football at the minute, is learning how to attack in transition and learning how to defend in transition. And if you got Johnston, who is, sort of looking like a fullback or looking like a centre back and strong defensively, then in the transition, if he is inverted, then the natural thought is in the midfield, Celtic are more defensively solid, and they won't get counter-attacked as badly in Europe against teams that are actually going to counter-attack against them. So, yeah, it's really difficult to talk about these things, because Celtic won't have a game that'll challenge these sort of theories of these players for another year until the Champions League comes rolling around again. So that's why I think it's frustrating that, there's no team in Scotland that just go about it differently. They're just all copying the St. Mirren template that was, men behind the ball as much as possible. We'll finish off with the January transfer window, because, as I said, it's going to shut, and I mean slam shut, at midnight tonight. But Celtic have their business done early doors and confirmed earlier today that there will be no more incomings at the club, but there might be outgoings. So we'll pretend that these players are actually going out, because they probably will be leaving by the end of the day. So in short, Celtic's transfer window in January: Alistair Johnston, Yuki Kobayashi, Tomoki Iwata, and Hyeon-Gyu Oh, all coming into the club, and I'm including any add-on fees. So the full fee round, that comes to around £7.3 million. And then the outgoings: Giakoumakis is said to be leaving the club to Atlanta. this evening. That's going to be around £4 million altogether for him. Juranovic has already left the club for Union Berlin. I think he got an assist at the weekend, actually. His full fee in total, including add-ons, was 10 million. Abelgar is probably going to leave the club before the end of the day. Jens has already left the club. He's joined Schalke. And it could be a loan deal for Stephen Welsh, who looks to be potentially joining Sheffield United in League One. They're going for promotion or fighting for promotion in League One. So Sheffield Wednesday, sorry, did I say Sheffield United? Sheffield Wednesday.
Matches to us in Sheffield.
Yeah, that's true. Is said to be the club that Stephen Welsh is looking to join, or they have inquired about him anyway. But the total comes to about £14 million. For Celtic incoming, so that's a net transfer of £7 million if you count in all the different add-ons and things like that. So before I ask you, I'll ask the people in the comments who are commenting flat out if you could rate Celtic's transfer window out of 10. Do so in the comments below, and we'll try to get to some of them before we finish off. So, I mean, £7 million net here, James. That's a Jota. That's a Cameron Vickers. This is why Celtics. I know you would rather see it be even better than it is, but this is why Celtic's transfer approach is really important and has been important under Ange, is that we have that money now in the bank that if we needed to go and get a player of the quality that costs 7 to 10 million, that it's there.
Yeah, I think we're continuing to raise the floor, meaning that I think that the robustness of the squad continues to improve, quality and depth, breadth of that depth. I guess the part that, and this is not on an unreasonable path. I guess where I've been a little bit critical is that I think that the upside is, more limited. I mean, I'm not saying, I was just saying he's a Tunisian national that Brighton just signed, 19-year-old midfielder for I think it was £5 million. That's the kind of profile. And Brighton's a smart club, obviously. They've gone about their transfer business pretty well, and you can see the catastrophic decline that they've had since the departure of their manager. So again, back to the issue of having a robust football operation in place. So that's what I'm more of the profile that I talk about when I say spend that kind of money, but get it in that age bracket that can turn into the 40, the 50 million theoretically. If we grow into that. But yeah, I mean, I'm very excited on O. I think what's going to happen is that as markets get more efficient, we're already seeing it. The Germans were kind of, I guess, the first into Asia in a big way from the European leagues, and now others are following, seeing how cheap the talent is on a relative basis. That's not going to last long. The clubs in Korea and Japanese aren't being run by blind, deaf, and dumb, stupid people. So eventually they're going to, re-rate what they're asking for their talent, particularly as the players achieve more success. So it's a nice place to be shopping now, and we're getting. It seems like we're getting quality for value for what we're buying. I just worry about 2 years from now, 3 years from now, as those markets get more efficient. But yeah, I think I'm really excited over O. I mean, he to me, he's outside of Kyogo. It's not just because he's a striker. I wish we would sign the O of the midfield. That would be, would be exciting. But yeah, I think based on the analysis I had done and just on first look, it looks like there's a lot of exciting potential there, and he's quite young, so there's that development that can still happen.
And Alan, I know it's early doors on a lot of these players, so we'll do proper deep dives on them when they've played a certain amount of minutes. But if you think about just the natural hit rate that Ange Postecoglou's had so far with his transfers, it's incredibly high in comparison to what Celtic have been doing in the past. If you look at the players that are leaving the club, Giakoumakis, he was a success. It was just that he was so much of a success that you couldn't get him into the first team lineup and he wasn't happy. Juranovic, overwhelming success at right back. Abelgar didn't work out, but no liability on the club because they didn't spend any money really to bring him into the club. Maurice Jens, again, a decent signing, filled in the gaps when Celtic needed, probably not the level of player they needed to progress. But again, no liability on the club here. He was a loan player, so they spent, maybe a couple of 100,000 on wages and on the initial loan fee. But again, you're not losing any money. We're not bringing in players for high enough fees and then just, hemorrhaging money before selling them off again for a loss. This is not what Celtic have become under Ange Postecoglou. And then if you think about the success of the players they're bringing in, you think Kobayashi looks like a pretty decent player so far in what we've seen of him. Johnston, we spoke about, looks like a good player. Iwata was the highest rated player in the J League last season, and Oh looks to be a really good player as well. So we could be getting 4 really strong players in, and having players that cost the club nothing, and then players who made the club money. So overall, I can't help but be pretty happy with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing now a pattern, which is what we like, of smart thinking around things like the timing of transfers. So, 3 of those players, I think, were here pretty much by the 1st of January, which meant they were able to assimilate as the calendar kind of ramped up again. Even though we didn't get in till later, we've been speaking with his club for a long, long time. Similarly with with Johnson, we were speaking with his club before the World Cup started. Well, before the World Cup started, obviously he had a decent World Cup, and that kind of highlighted a little bit more publicity on his performances. But in terms of the timing aspect, and it's like a million miles away. Now, some of that's to do with the fact that we're now dealing in markets who operate at a sort of January to December football calendar, and that means that when it comes to this transfer window, they're basically in post-season. So that's obviously a lot easier to deal with Japanese clubs, for example, in that scenario. What my concern is are we being successful in that market because of Ange Postecoglou and Frank Trimboli, and if they walked out the door, would we still be successful in that market with Michael Nicholson and Mark Lowell? That's a question. I don't know, right? But that's the thing I'd want to see in terms of next steps, is that becomes a sustainable relationship, if you like, that the club has in that region with agents, with clubs, etc., on a sustainable basis. So the timing has been helped with the fact we're operating in markets that we hitherto haven't done. Then you mentioned the cost there, and I think just the value that Celtic appear to have got. Now, I'll kind of demur on what these players are actually like in terms of on the field, because it's just too early days. But I think to get I think we all accept that the J League is a pretty strong league. So to get the Player of the Year, for under $1 million is probably sounds like good business. To get a left-footed, left-sided centre back who's not rubbish for nothing is probably a good deal. Johnson, I think, based on models I saw, we didn't overpay, we didn't underpay, we probably paid around about what we should have done for his profile. And with O, he's a young player, and as I say, it's the one. I don't know a lot about him, but he apparently the manager's incredibly excited about having him in the door. So that's probably a good sign, right? So we're playing it smart from a cost perspective, and as I say, if the rookie manager Mickey Beale is watching, avert your ears now. But over the 2 seasons so far, Ange has brought in roughly 10 million more than what he's spent. That's just lucky, I know, but that comes from hopefully being smart in the market. Now, the thing that really fascinates me actually about the players is actually nothing to do with the data or the profiles. It's other characteristics. So what do I mean by that? So apparently Postecoglou, one of the things he was looking for was a greater sort of utility in players that was coming in. He wanted to get some players that had some flexibility about how and where they played. So we've got Alistair Johnson that we talked about, who profiles like a right-sided centre-back, can play as a wing-back and also as an orthodox full-back or an inverted full-back even. We've got Iwata, who, although has had a great season primarily as a defensive midfielder, can also play centre-back. And then we've got O, who started his fledgling career as a left-sided forward and then moved into a centre-forward later in the season. Kobayashi, I think, is excluded from that because, as I say, you don't know how difficult it. Well, you probably do know how difficult it is to find a left-footed, left-sided centre back who's actually any good at all. It's just really, really rare. So to get, as I say, to get one of those for zero, who's over 6 foot tall, and as I say, his early performances, he got troubled by Curtis Main quite a bit in his debut. Let's be honest about that. But he also dominated the ball. He had more touches, more passes, more pack passes than any other player in that game. Also in his second game against again Morton, obviously context important, but he had double the number of challenge successes than any other player. That suggests to me that this lad's not lacking in confidence and not lacking in character in terms of the way that he played. And that brings me to my second point about the sort of the personality and the character of the players that we're buying. And this again speaks to Postecoglou and the quote about you buy the man first and the player second. I think it's a nice soundbite. The reality is no doubt more subtle than that. But what I think we've seen in the very short time we've seen those players. So I mentioned Kobayashi and the fact that he took responsibility from the first moment. He dominated the ball. In the second game, he was the most aggressive defender in the team. So again, that all speaks to me about confidence, personality, taking responsibility. Anyone that hasn't watched an interview with Alistair Johnston, I recommend that you do. This is a kid that just exudes. He's articulate, he's intelligent, he's incredibly self-confident, as you'd probably expect from somebody from the sort of North American academy system. Just look back at that game at Ibrox where he was giving it out. He was giving it out physically. That was his debut, right? So this is clearly a kid with personality, again with character, etc. Iwata we've only seen for 45 minutes, but what struck me most about Iwata was the fact he was communicating. I don't even know if he speaks English at all, to be honest with you. Maybe he does. Someone may know. But he was pointing, gesticulating. He was telling players where to go. He was trying to shuffle players around. This is his debut at Celtic Park. He doesn't even speak the language. That struck me as being incredibly assertive, incredibly confident, taking responsibility, lots of character. So, and then we come to O, who's only 21 years old, but you saw the way how physically he was in a couple of challenges. He's a very different player to Kyogo, very different, much more likely to get involved. In fact, he completed 2 passes in 8 minutes. Kyogo completed 3 in 82. He's just going to get involved a lot more. But you saw that, you saw the fact he didn't hesitate banging that cross across the box to Maeda. You saw how robustly he won the ball back in his own defensive third and broke up the field. This is a guy, I think, with personality, with self-confidence, and the fact that how much he drove to try and get this move personally with his club in a respectful way, but he made it clear this is what he wanted to do. So this for me is an incredibly interesting window in terms of the variety of tools that each of the players has, but also both the uptick in squad physicality and the uptick in that sense of personality and character and strength of character that is now in that squad, I think is really important. So that to me is the big takeaway.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and this is a point to do about nothing, but I was just looking through Celtic squad there, and they can start without moving any player into a position that they don't play. They can start the game with over 50% of their starting 11 being from Asia, which I think must be a first for any British team. Like anyone in Britain, I can't think of any other team that has 5 or 6 natural players in their natural position from the continent of Asia. So I mean, it is a point about nothing, but it is also a very sure sign of where Celtic have been shopping over the last year and a half, 2 years.
I think these aspects are important to the manager because we've actually lost, more than likely going to lose, 2 sort of 27, 28-year-olds, and we've gained some, even though the Japanese boys, especially, as you said before, 25, Iwata's 25, but in football experience terms, he's more like a 21, 22-year-old in terms of number of minutes he's got under his belt. So I think Postecoglou is very sensitive to that. I believe he didn't want to lose Bitton and Rogic were offered new contracts. He wants to have experienced bodies around the place, Forrest, Hart, etc. McGregor, obviously the captain, but we have lost a bit of that. So I think that, and as you say, the makeup of the squad from sort of nationalistic perspective, you do need to have a balance. Of course you do, and I think these are all factors you have to be sensitive to in terms of your composition of the squad.
Well, you don't want cliques developing either, and that's naturally what happens between players who speak the same language. So I know that it's a different language for O, but with the Japanese players especially, you want to be sure that they're able to communicate with the other players as well, and so you don't get formations of cliques. Sorry, James, I cut across you there.
No, I was just going to say the one area that's still nagging me is, again, when I think about the different pieces and how they fit together is speed. I think we're still operating with a relative speed deficit. So, even on the wings, if you look at, basically have Maeda and Abada that are probably our top end speed guys. And, this is the challenge that we have, is that if you dial in guys with that kind of speed at the price levels that we're shopping, do they have the skills on the ball that you want or need technically, which is probably the weakness that those two guys have. And then you have somebody like Haksabanovic, who, again, and this goes back to when I looked at him when we signed him, that's what stood out. I was like, wow, this guy's really good technically on the ball, but he's not going to outrun too many people. And, even in the last time we played Livingston, he got smoked for pace by, I think it was Devlin, in a sequence of play. It's like, oh, Jesus, if a Livingston guy is smoking one of Celtic's wingers for pace, that's not a good sign purely from a speed perspective. And again, if it was a one-off, and Jota's not a speed guy, he's a technical guy, he's a creative guy. And in midfield, we don't really have that high-end speed. Probably Hatate is the closest. And he has some other physical issues just because of his size. So, I'd say that's still, my lingering issue is how do we ramp how we play when we don't, even at the fullback position now. I think Alistair, once he gets moving, is pretty quick, but he's not, that's what Juranovic had. He got 0 to 60 in, 3 seconds kind of thing, and stayed there. And, Taylor has improved a lot in that, but he doesn't have that high end either. So, it's when you're playing as aggressive as we do, and this is the discussion about Mooy and O'Reilly and all these other guys where they have all these great technical attributes, but when you're playing this specific kind of way and you don't have that kind of pace, and really none of them, that's the one thing Starfelt does. For one of the values he has had is he does have pretty good recovery pace for a center back. So, how do these things all kind of fit together? And that's the one that I'm still nervous about.
Yeah, and Juranovic, who was one of Celtic's faster players, got absolutely destroyed by pace of Mikhail Mudryk, who's now playing for Chelsea, and Vinicius Jr., who's obviously, one of Real Madrid's best players. That's who you're coming up against in the
100 million gets you.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
That's FU pace, right? There aren't that many guys out there. That's why they end up at the top of the top 5 leagues. So this, everyone else is kind of dealing with this intersection between skill and pace, and that's what my observation is. I think we're tilted a little on the skill side, and maybe to the deficit of that pace. And, again, vast majority of the time, it's not going to matter.
So we should re-sign John Joe Kenny. That's what I'm hearing.
Oh, he's lightning quick. That's what I've heard.
Absolutely.
So we'll finish off then. Livingston tomorrow night. Any mad takes before we finish up the podcast on coming up against Livingston at home?
No, I actually just wrote a piece on them relative to Celtic, and they are fascinating. I've said this before. I think they're probably the most interesting team in how they've operated, how they've optimized for that horrific home field advantage that they have, home pitch advantage, and just a little nuances. So, in what I looked at, they are third. And I calculated back, or I didn't calculate, but I ran reports and StatsBomb from when they start in the SPFL at the beginning, and happened to coincide with Livingston coming up into the Premiership in the 18-19 season. Livingston is third in set play XG over that period, behind Celtic and Rangers. Okay. For the team with the lowest budget in the league, that's if there's going to be a place playing at that pitch in the macaroni with its relatively narrow, the fact that they do a lot of long throw-ins, right? It's that kind of being on the margin, smarter than other teams. And I thought that was shown over the weekend. Why Dundee United was not doing long throws into our box when they had, for them, not that inconsequential number of throws in angles that they could have. And how many times did they just throw into a guy and lose possession within like half a second? It's those nuances where a club like Livingston are smarter. The problem is most of those advantages are diluted heavily at Celtic Park. From their perspective, so that's why I think there's such a headache, or they can be a headache at their own park. But yeah, the thing that they have not been as passive or bunkering, and they tend to be more man to man. So I suspect they could give us a headache for a half hour kind of thing, and then more likely to be like a 4 or 5-0 kind of setup. I think would be the likely with a lot of second half potentially.
Yeah, I think Martindale said today that if the league was decided on points per pound, whatever that means, then they would win it every single year.
And again, it's ridiculous because it'd be like saying if Celtic got out of, this is kind of what I wrote, it's like if Celtic got out of a Champions League group, that they had the points per pound over Man City, right? So there, to a degree, there's a train of thought there that's not insane, but you're comparing apples to oranges because they're so their wage bill is about 1/30th of Celtics, right? That's like there's only I did this analysis, it's fresh of mind. Out of the big 5 leagues, there's only 3 teams in the big 5 leagues that are even close to that ratio relative to the big team in their league, and 2 of them are in France. Generally, the 2 that fight relegation every year in Ligue A. So the skew in the resources in Scotland is abnormal relative to even most other leagues, and there's positives of that. That, as I just went over, if you're reasonably smart, meaning that there's a huge gap between Celtic and Rangers, and really the bottom 7. So if you're smartly run amongst that group of 7, you can do what Livingston's doing because there's not that big a difference in resources in those bottom 7. But it's just a completely different planet up to where we are. So it would be like one of those teams in France getting up into the mid-table or getting in fighting for a European spot. It's just that would be quite the accomplishment. So it is an accomplishment what Livingston's been doing, and they've been doing consistently. Like, this is not just one year where they fluked their way into the top half. So I think it's been repeatable. But it's totally different ball of wax.
Livingston could potentially be Scotland's representative in the Europa Conference League next year. If they finish in the position that they are. I'm not sure. I would need to confirm this, but I think UEFA might have rules against plastic pitches. Do Livingston have a plastic pitch?
We played Bodo Glimt on one. So.
Maybe it's just the quality of the stadium, so I'm not sure. It would be a real punch in the balls if Livingston qualified the Conference League and then couldn't play at the Macaroni.
Yeah, no, they'd find a way around it. They could play at Easter Road or something like that. But
final thought then, Al?
Yeah, no, I read the article with Martindale, and honestly, reading it with a perspective of, I understand what he's trying to say, even if his language was a bit clumsy. I couldn't disagree with anything that he said if you actually read it, rather than just react to the headline, right?
Yeah, the soundbite was very provocative.
Yeah, exactly. So you just need to read what he was actually saying, and I think he was just really saying what we've been saying on the show for a few years now, which is that outside of the top 2, they're arguably the best, the most innovative and smart football club. I'm not saying best football, because obviously it's pretty agricultural if you want to be judgmental about it. But in terms of smarts and in terms of results over resources, they're easily the most successful club outside the top 2. To be honest with you, in fact, you might even argue they're the most successful outside of Celtic, actually, really. I'm not just saying that. I'm not saying that out of bias. It's a genuine observation, given the number of trophies that that have been won. You know, two St Johnstone. St Johnstone have got 2 as well. You know what I mean? So yeah, Livingston, I would say, it's going to be a hard game tomorrow, because it always is. And you know, they're on a decent run. They're unbeaten in 5 matches in the league. So you know, this isn't uncommon for them. As James says, they've got loads to play for. So yeah, it's going to absolutely be a difficult game, no doubt about it. And we'll go in with a absolutely full strength team, no doubt.
Yeah, Wednesday evening against Livingston in a cold, bitter February evening. That's the SPFL. That is summed up.
No games on Sky.
Not
a single game on Sky.
Sure, why would they? It's not as if they're the title
fixture.
sponsor or the title broadcasters.
Yeah. Full fixture.
Why would they?
In England, right? There is one game in League One, and there's the EFL. I don't know if that's the Johnson Paint or some English. I think it's the League Cup, right? Semi-final, second leg, Manchester United against Nottingham Forest, right? There is no.
And
other
United
English
are 3-0 up from the previous leg.
Right, I didn't even know that.
There
are no other English games, right? And yet there's no Scottish games on Sky. It's absolutely scandalous.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I need to go, so I don't want to get into a deep discussion about this, but it speaks volumes that BT, who don't even have the rights for Scotland, are still creating far better content for Scottish football fans on their YouTube channel. They've done really, really great stuff with the Curry Club podcasts and sit-down interviews with all the different managers and personalities in Scottish football. So that speaks volumes compared to what Sky serve up each and every week for Scottish football fans. So it's atrocious. And we've spoken about that before. But that's where we're going to leave it, because I need to run out the door. And I thank you and James and Alan for their contributions on the podcast, and to everybody who is watching on YouTube, on live, and for leaving comments as well. If you want to get this podcast, it's available on Spotify or on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts as well. So after the Livingston game, we shall touch base. Until then, good luck.